The envelope arrived at 5:04 in the morning. Thomas Harker was already dressed. He was always already dressed. 14 years of Royal Guard service had rewired something fundamental in him, some internal clock that refused to let him sleep past 4:30 regardless of what shift he was working, regardless of the season, regardless of whether he had anywhere to be. He sat at his kitchen table with a mug of tea he had not yet touched, watching the window go from black to the dark gray of early London winter when the knock came. Not the front door, the side door, the one that faced the narrow service lane behind his building. He opened it without hesitation. A palace courier stood in the lane, young, sharp-faced, in plain clothes rather than livery. He held a single envelope sealed with dark wax, not the ornate crest used for ceremonial correspondence, but a flat, plain press. The kind used internally. The kind used when something needed to travel without announcing itself. "Sergeant Harker," the courier said. "Yes." "This is for you, directly, not through the roster office." Thomas took the envelope. The courier was already walking away before Thomas had turned it over in his hands. No signature on the back, no routing code, just his name, printed in a hand he did not recognize. He sat back down at the table. The tea had gone cold. He opened the envelope with a butter knife, the way his father had always opened letters carefully, as though the paper itself deserved respect. Inside was a single folded sheet. He read it once, then again, then a third time slowly, the way he read anything that surprised him. The sheet contained three things: a time 6:30 a.m., a set of directions not to any named room or wing, but a sequence of turns and stairwells described by position alone, left at the second maintenance junction, down the unmarked stairwell past the B-level electrical room, continue to the end of the passage, and an instruction, 4 words printed in the same plain hand as his name on the envelope. "Admit no one, hold." That was everything. No name of a superior, no reason, no duration, no designation for the location he was being sent to, no indication of who had written the order or under whose authority it had been issued. Thomas set the sheet down on the table and looked at it for a long moment. In 14 years, he had received unusual assignments before. All guards did. The palace was not one building but many buildings layered on top of each other across centuries, rooms that had been sealed and reopened, corridors that connected wings built in different eras, spaces that appeared on older maps but had been reclassified or forgotten in the institutional memory of whoever maintained the current floor plans. He had once spent 6 hours guarding a door in the north wing that turned out to be a linen storage room. He had once been posted at a stairwell for an entire shift and never been told why, and had never asked. The palace ran on a system of compartmentalized information. You knew your part. You trusted that someone above you knew the whole. That was the structure. That was the culture. That was, Thomas had long believed, the only way an institution this old and this complex could function without tearing itself apart. He folded the sheet, put it in his inside jacket pocket, finished his cold tea in 2 swallows, and left for the palace at 5:40, 40 minutes before he needed to be there, because he had always believed that arriving early was the most reliable form of respect a man in his position could show. The directions were precise. He entered through the staff gate on the west side of the palace grounds, showed his credentials to the morning duty officer, a quiet man named Reynolds whom Thomas had known for 6 years and who asked no questions, and made his way into the interior without signing the public-facing duty roster. This was unusual. The duty roster was not optional. Every guard signed in for every shift, every time, without exception. It was how the palace tracked bodies inside the building. It was basic security protocol. Thomas had almost reached for the pen out of habit when the duty officer glanced at his face and said, quietly and without looking up from his own paperwork, "Not today, Sergeant." So someone had arranged this. Someone had spoken to Reynolds before Thomas arrived. Someone had cleared a path that left no paper trace. Thomas walked deeper into the palace. He had spent 14 years in this building, and still there were parts of it that felt unfamiliar to him. Not foreign exactly, but layered, like a word you have said so many times it starts to lose its meaning. He knew the public wings. He knew the ceremonial routes and the working corridors and the back passages that staff used to move between functions without crossing the tourist-facing areas. He knew the kitchens and the press rooms and the security hub on the third floor of the East Wing. He did not know where he was going now. He followed the directions from the sheet. Left at the second maintenance junction, a turning behind a gray door marked only with a yellow electrical hazard symbol that he had walked past hundreds of times without ever opening. He opened it now. A narrow corridor, pipes running along the ceiling, the smell of old stone, and something faintly chemical. Fluorescent lights that buzzed at a frequency just below comfortable. Down the unmarked stairwell past the B-level electrical room. He found the stairwell behind a second door, this one slightly warped in its frame, the kind of fit that told you the door was rarely used. The stairs were concrete, functional, institutional, not the wide carpeted staircases of the public palace. These were the bones of the building, the parts that held everything up without being seen. He went down one level, then another. He was underground now, below the basement level he had occasionally worked in during storage audits, below the level shown on the security maps he had been trained on, below, as far as he could tell, the level shown on any map he had ever seen. The stairwell ended at another corridor. This one was different from the maintenance passage above. It was clean. Not recently cleaned. Thomas had spent enough time in institutional building to know the difference between a space that was regularly maintained and a space that had simply been left undisturbed long enough to settle into its own stillness. The floor was stone, smooth, slightly damp in the way of deep underground spaces. The walls were painted a pale institutional green that had not been fashionable since approximately 1970. The lighting was lower here, a series of bare bulbs in wire cages, some of them flickering very slightly. At the end of the corridor, perhaps 30 meters away, was a door. Solid wood, dark, almost black with age. A simple handle, no electronic lock, no keypad, no camera above it. Nothing to indicate what was on the other side. Nothing to indicate this space existed at all on any official record. Thomas walked to the door and stood in front of it. He placed himself with his back to the door, facing the corridor the way he had been trained to stand a post, visible, present, giving nothing away in either direction. His hands at his sides, his chin level, his breathing slow and deliberate the way it got when he was working, when some internal mechanism shifted from ordinary Thomas Harker to the version of himself that existed inside this uniform. It was 6:28 a.m. He had been 2 minutes early. He stood, and that was when he noticed what he had not noticed in the dim light of the corridor when he first entered it. There was light coming from underneath the door. Not the fluorescent buzz of the corridor above. Warmer, steadier. The kind of light that came from a lamp inside a room where people were present and comfortable. And with it, so faint he almost convinced himself he was imagining it, the smell of coffee. Fresh coffee, recently made. Someone was already inside. Thomas looked at the light under the door for a long moment. He thought about the sealed envelope, the directions that described only turns and not destinations, the 4 words printed on the sheet. He thought about the duty officer who had told him not to sign the roster. He thought about the 14 years he had spent learning when to ask questions and when to simply stand. He turned his gaze back to the corridor. Admit no one, hold. He would hold. The first one arrived at 7:15. Thomas heard him before he saw him, footsteps on the concrete stairs, unhurried, the sound of someone who knew where he was going. A young man appeared at the far end of the corridor. Mid-20s, slight build, wearing the pale blue lanyard of a palace administrative assistant. He carried a manila envelope flat against his chest with both hands. The way junior staff carried documents they had been told to treat carefully. He walked the length of the corridor without hesitation and stopped 3 feet from Thomas. "Morning," he said, friendly, routine, the tone of someone performing a task they performed every day, document delivery for the room. Thomas looked at him. "What room?" A small pause. "This one behind you." "What is the designation of this room?" Another pause, slightly longer. "I was just told to deliver to this location." "Who gave you the delivery instruction?" The young man shifted his weight slightly. "The document center, 3rd floor, it's a standard routing." Thomas looked at the envelope in the man's hands, then back at his face. "I cannot admit you. These are my orders." "It's just a document delivery. I just need to hand this through." "I cannot admit you," Thomas said again. Same tone, same pace. "Or pass anything through on your behalf." The young man stood for a moment as though trying to decide whether to escalate or retreat. He was not built for escalation. Thomas could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the way his grip tightened on the envelope, not with anger but with the discomfort of a person who had been put in a position they had not agreed to be in. "Can I ask who authorized your post here?" the young man said. "No," Thomas said. The young man nodded slowly. He took a small step back. Then he turned and walked back the way he had come. His footsteps were slightly faster on the return. Thomas watched him go until he disappeared around the curve of the stairwell. Then Thomas stood still and thought about what he had just seen. The delivery had been genuine, the envelope, the lanyard, the manner, but something about the exchange had not sat right in a way Thomas was still working out. It was the hesitation when he asked what room. A genuine delivery person in a building this large, navigating this deep into an unmarked sub-basement, would have arrived with more certainty, not less. They would have known the room number or the recipient name. They would have had a form to sign. This young man had arrived with a reason, but no paperwork. He had been sent to test the door. Thomas filed this thought in the quiet back part of his mind that he used for things he was not yet ready to examine directly. He returned his gaze to the corridor. He breathed. He waited. The second one arrived at 8:40. This one was different. He was perhaps 60, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark suit that had not come off any rack. He walked with the practiced deliberateness of someone who had spent decades in buildings like this one. Not the deliberateness of authority exactly, but the deliberateness of institutional seniority, of a man who knew how every room in this palace functioned and had made his peace with being the person who kept them functioning. He carried a leather folder under his left arm. His right hand was free, held slightly away from his body in the way of someone who was making a conscious effort to appear non-threatening while feeling the opposite. He stopped in front of Thomas and looked at him the way senior officials looked at guards, not unkindly, but with the particular quality of attention that assessed rather than acknowledged. "Gerald Foss," he said, "Senior Administrator, Household and Estates." Thomas said nothing. He waited. "I need access to this room," Foss said. "I have documents that require a signature from the individuals currently inside." "I cannot admit you, sir." Foss's expression did not change. "Do you know who I am?" "You told me your name and title, sir." "Then you know that I have Level 4 access clearance to every room in this palace." "This room is not on the access clearance system, sir." A short silence. Something moved behind Foss's eyes, not surprise exactly, more like confirmation of something he had already suspected. "I see. And who issued your orders for this post?" "I'm not able to share that information, sir." Foss shifted the leather folder from one arm to the other. "Sergeant," he glanced at Thomas's name tag, Haka, "I want you to understand that the meeting currently taking place inside this room has not been sanctioned through proper channels. The individuals inside have bypassed standard procedure. What they are doing is irregular, possibly more than irregular." Thomas looked at him steadily. "I have my orders, sir." "Your orders," Foss said, and the word came out with a slight compression, the way a man said a word when he was controlling what he actually wanted to say, "were issued through irregular channels themselves. Are you certain those orders represent the interests of this institution?" It was a good question. Thomas had asked it to himself quietly, in the part of his mind he did not show people. He had not arrived at an answer, but the absence of an answer was not the same as permission to abandon his post. "My orders are clear, sir. I cannot admit you." Foss held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he said, quietly and with great precision, "You are making a decision today that you do not have the information to make correctly." "That may be true, sir." "It is true." "Even so," Thomas said, "I cannot admit you." Foss turned away. He walked back down the corridor with the same deliberate step he had arrived with, but the set of his back was different now, tighter, the shoulder blades pulled together in the way of a man who was recalculating. At the base of the stairs he paused, one hand on the wall. He did not look back. He simply stood there for a moment as though he was memorizing something. Then he went up. Thomas waited until the sound of his footsteps had fully faded. Then he exhaled through his nose slowly and returned to stillness. In the quiet that followed, Thomas became aware of the room behind him in a different way. Not with alarm, with attention, with the kind of careful listening that happens when a person has nothing to do but stand in one place and notice things. The voices inside were not loud enough to be understood. They were the rhythm of conversation, a sentence, a pause, another sentence, more than one speaker. He counted at minimum 2 distinct voices and suspected a third. The pauses between them were long in the way of pauses between people who are thinking carefully, not in the way of pauses between people who are arguing or uncertain. These were people who knew exactly what they were discussing and were choosing their words with the patience of people for whom words, once chosen, would matter. The smell of coffee had not faded. Someone in there had a thermos or a pot. They had come prepared for a long stay. Once at around 9 a.m., he heard the sound of papers being moved. Not shuffled casually but laid out and repositioned, the deliberate sound of a table being organized, of a presentation being structured. Whatever was happening in that room had been planned well in advance. Whatever was being decided had been thought about for longer than today. Thomas stood and listened without listening, the way a guard learned to exist in the presence of things he was not meant to know. He kept his eyes on the corridor. He kept his hands at his sides. He kept his face as neutral as the green-painted wall behind him. But he thought about the light under the door, about the young man who had arrived without paperwork, about Gerald Foss who had arrived with questions disguised as statements, about the word irregular which Foss had used twice, once openly and once in the pauses between his sentences. Irregular. Not illegal, not criminal, irregular. There was a great deal of space between those words, a great deal of space in which many different kinds of things could live. She arrived at 10:20 without announcing herself. Thomas heard nothing before she appeared, no footsteps on the stairs, no sound of the corridor door, nothing. She was simply there when he looked up, standing at the far end of the passage with her hands clasped in front of her, watching him with an expression of measured assessment. She was perhaps 55. Silver-gray hair pulled back with the kind of precision that took practice. She wore a charcoal jacket and trousers, not a uniform, not a ceremonial outfit, the working clothes of a senior professional who had stopped needing to announce her rank through clothing, because her rank announced itself through the way she stood in a room. Thomas recognized her the way you recognized a face you had seen at the edge of formal events. Never in the foreground, always at the shoulder of someone important, always half-turned toward whoever needed managing. He had seen her once, 3 years ago, standing behind a senior member of the royal family at a private garden event Thomas had been posted at. He had not known her name then. He did not know it now. She walked the length of the corridor without hurrying. She stopped at the same 3-foot distance Foss had stopped at, as though there were an invisible boundary drawn in the stone floor that every visitor instinctively respected. She looked at Thomas for a long moment before she spoke. "How long have you been in service?" she asked, not as an opening challenge, genuinely. 14 years, ma'am." She nodded once. "And in 14 years, have you ever been posted to a location with no designation, no camera, no partner, and no stated duration?" "No, ma'am." "And yet here you are." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at the door behind him, not with urgency, with something more like recognition. The way you looked at a thing you had known was there before you arrived. "I am private secretary to a member of this family. I'm not going to tell you which member because I don't believe it would change anything about what you are going to do, and I find unnecessary information in a situation like this tends to complicate rather than clarify." Thomas said nothing. He waited. "I want to go in," she said. "I cannot admit you, ma'am." She did not react to this. She had expected it. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to change that." She paused. "I'm simply going to tell you something before I leave." Thomas held his position and listened. "The people inside that room are having a conversation that someone does not want recorded, documented, or witnessed." She said it the way you stated a weather condition, factually, without alarm. "That is why there are no cameras in this corridor. That is why this room does not exist on the official floor plan. That is why you were brought here alone through a chain of instruction that leaves no paper trail." She looked at him directly. "You are not protecting a room, Sergeant Harker. You are protecting the fact that this conversation is happening. There is a difference." Thomas felt something tighten very slightly in his chest. He kept his breathing level. "I have my orders, ma'am." "I know you do." She unclasped her hands and held one at her side and one briefly toward the door, not pointing at it, just acknowledging it. "I only want you to understand what you are holding the line for. Not the room, not the door, the conversation. Someone decided that this conversation needed to happen without an audience, without a record, and without interference." She paused one final time. "You have no idea what you are protecting." The words settled over the corridor like a change in air pressure. Thomas looked at her. "No, ma'am, I don't." She held his gaze for one more moment. There was something in her expression that was not contempt and not admiration, and was perhaps very close to a kind of sorrowful respect. The look of someone who understood the position another person was in, and found it both necessary and genuinely sad. Then she turned and walked back the way she had come. Her footsteps were completely silent. Thomas watched her reach the stairs and disappear, and then he stood in the empty corridor and understood for the first time that he was not going to find out what was behind the door. Not today. Probably not ever. That understanding did not change anything. He faced the corridor, he breathed, he waited. Gerald Foss came back at 11. He was alone this time. He had left the leather folder somewhere upstairs. He walked the corridor differently now, not with the measured deliberateness of his first visit, but with something quieter, more personal. He stopped in front of Thomas and looked at him the way a man looked at another man when he had decided to stop performing and simply speak. "I'm going to be honest with you," Foss said. Thomas waited. "The first time I came down here I was representing a position, an institutional position. I was here because certain people above me wanted to know whether this door was guarded and how firmly." He paused. "It is, and very." Thomas said nothing. "Now I'm here for a different reason." Foss put his hands in his jacket pockets, a gesture that made him look older, less official, more like a tired man in a good suit. "I've been in this palace for 22 years. I have seen things come and go in this family that the public never knows about and never will. I have signed documents and witnessed agreements and participated in decisions that will never appear in any published record." He looked at the floor briefly, then back at Thomas. "I know how the institution protects itself. I know the methods." Thomas watched him. "What is happening inside that room," Foss said, "is one of those methods. And I am not certain, genuinely not certain, that it is a method that should be used this time. That the decision being made in there is the right one for the people it will affect." Thomas said nothing. "I'm not asking you to let me in anymore," Foss said. "I know you won't, I've accepted that." He looked toward the door. "I'm asking you to step aside for 60 seconds, not to open the door, not to do anything. Just to be somewhere else in this corridor for 60 seconds, that is all." Thomas looked at him. He saw the fatigue in the man's face, the genuine conflict in it. He saw that Foss was not performing now, that whatever this was, it was real. He saw a man who believed, truly believed, that something wrong was happening inside that room and that 60 seconds was all that separated the decision from its undoing. He understood all of it. "No, sir," Thomas said. Foss closed his eyes for a moment, opened them. "You understand that I may be trying to prevent something harmful." "I understand that you believe that, sir." "It's not belief. Foss stopped. He pressed his lips together. He looked at a point on the wall past Thomas's shoulder. "You're not going to move." "No, sir." A long silence. Long enough that Thomas could hear, faintly, the sound of a voice from inside the room. A single sentence, unintelligible, followed by a pause. Foss heard it too. His jaw tightened. Then he straightened. He pulled his hands from his pockets. He put the performance back on, not the aggressive performance of his first visit, but the worn, quiet performance of a man who had done what he could and had arrived at the limit of what he was able to do. "You're a good guard, Sergeant Harker," he said, and he meant it. Thomas could hear that he meant it and that it gave Foss no satisfaction at all to say it. "Thank you, sir." Foss walked away. This time he did not pause at the stairs. He went straight up and his footsteps faded and the corridor was empty again. Thomas stood in the silence. He thought about what Foss had said. He thought about what the woman had said. He thought about the young man who had arrived first with his unmarked envelope, who had been sent to test whether the door was held and by whom. He thought about Commander Aldridge, who had issued these orders through an envelope delivered to his side door before dawn. He thought about the duty officer who had told him not to sign the roster. He thought about the word that had been in his mind all morning without him, allowing it to surface properly. Whose side am I on? He had been a royal guard for 14 years. He had taken an oath to the institution. He had served it without doubt, without hesitation, without the kind of personal opinion that eroded usefulness. He had always believed that the structure was sound, that orders came from people who understood more than he did, and that following those orders was not weakness or passivity, but a form of institutional trust that kept everything functioning. But today, for the first time in 14 years, he was not certain that his orders and the institution's best interest were the same thing. And he could not resolve that uncertainty, because he did not have enough information to resolve it, because the information had been deliberately withheld from him, because he had been placed here precisely for his willingness to follow orders he did not understand. He was being used. He had known that from the moment he read the envelope. It had not mattered then. He had been used before. Every guard had placed at a post, pointed in a direction, given a rule and left to hold it without context. That was the job. That was what he was for. But standing now in this corridor, 14 years into his service, 35 years into his life, Thomas Harker faced a truth that no amount of training had quite prepared him for. Sometimes the job asked you to hold a line on behalf of something you could not see, and you held it anyway, not because you were certain it was right, but because you had decided, long before this morning, who you were going to be inside this uniform. He faced the corridor. He breathed. He held. The door opened at 12:47 in the afternoon. Thomas had been standing for 6 hours and 23 minutes. He knew the number precisely because he had checked his watch at noon and again at 12:30, and had calculated the difference when he heard the handle turn. 6 hours and 23 minutes of standing in a sub-basement corridor that did not exist on any official map, in front of a door that held light and coffee and muffled voices and decisions he would never be permitted to understand. He did not turn around. His orders had said nothing about what to do when the door opened. They had said only to hold the position, to admit no one. They had not addressed departure. But Thomas had spent 14 years learning the unspoken grammar of this institution, the things that went without saying precisely because they were understood by anyone who truly belonged here. And the thing that went without saying in this case was simple. You faced the corridor. You kept your back to the door. Whatever happened behind you was not yours to see. He heard the door open fully. The warmth of the room reached him first, not dramatically warmer than the corridor, but noticeably so, the warmth of a space where 4 people had been sitting for hours, breathing and thinking and drinking coffee from a thermos. He smelled that coffee now properly, not as a trace but as a presence. Dark roast, strong. Then he heard footsteps. They came one at a time, measured, unhurried. The footsteps of people who had finished what they came to do and were leaving without theater. The first set passed him on his left, a firm, even step, a person of medium height based on the sound, moving with confidence. The second set came close behind, slightly heavier, a man's weight, deliberate. The third set paused for just a fraction of a second behind Thomas, close enough that he felt the displacement of air, close enough that whoever it was could have spoken to him or touched his shoulder or looked at his face. They did not. They moved on. The fourth set were the lightest, quick, precise, the step of someone who had already put the room behind them before they walked out of it. 4 people, 4 sets of footsteps moving down the corridor toward the stairs, one after another, without conversation, without acknowledgement of Thomas, without any indication that they saw him at all. Which was, he understood, exactly the point. He was furniture. He was the lock on the door. He was not a person to these people in this moment. He was a function. The last footsteps reached the stairwell and began to ascend. Thomas counted to 30, then he turned. The corridor was empty. The door behind him was closed. The light that had been coming from underneath it since 6:28 that morning was gone. The gap at the bottom of the door was dark. Whoever had been inside had turned off the lamp or the thermos or whatever warm light source had been burning in there all morning, and left the room exactly as they had found it, sealed, dark, silent, indistinguishable from the closed door of a maintenance cupboard or a disused storage space. Thomas looked at the door for a long moment. Then he faced the corridor again and waited for whoever was coming to tell him he could leave. Commander Aldridge arrived at 1:15. He was a man Thomas had known professionally for 9 years, not closely, not as a friend or a confidant, but with the solid familiarity of 2 people who had shared the same institutional world long enough to understand each other's professional language without needing to explain it. Aldridge was 61, thin, with the careful posture of someone who had been told since childhood that how you stood was a reflection of who you were. He had gray eyes that assessed everything and expressed very little. He appeared at the end of the corridor and walked to Thomas without speaking. He looked at Thomas's face the way a doctor looked at a patient checking for something specific, something he already expected to find. "Walk with me," he said. They walked in silence through the corridor, up the unmarked stairs, back through the maintenance passage, up through the B-level door, and into the inhabited parts of the palace where the air was different, warmer, more complex, carrying the layered smells of carpet and old wood and cleaning product and people. The sounds of the building returned around them gradually, the way sound returned after something loud had stopped. The distant murmur of a television in a staff room, a telephone ringing twice and stopping. The click of keyboard keys from an open office door. Aldridge led him to a small room on the 2nd floor that Thomas had never been in before. It was not an office exactly. It had no desk, no computer, just a table and 4 chairs, and a narrow window that looked out on an interior courtyard. The kind of room where informal conversations happened. The kind of room that existed in institutional buildings for precisely the purpose of speaking without being overheard. Aldridge closed the door. He did not sit. He stood by the window with his hands behind his back and looked at the courtyard for a moment before he turned to Thomas. "You followed your orders," he said. "Yes, sir." "Completely." "Yes, sir." Aldridge nodded once. 3 individuals attempted to gain entry. It was not a question. Thomas answered it as one anyway. "Yes, sir. A junior staff member at 7:15, Mr. Foss at 8:40, a woman I did not know the name of at 10:20. Mr. Foss returned at approximately 11:00. Aldridge's expression did not change. "What did they say to you?" Thomas considered the question. He gave a precise summary of each encounter: the junior man with the envelope, Foss's 2 visits, the woman's quiet and deliberate words. He gave it the way he would give any operational report, factually, in sequence, without editorial. He did not include his own thoughts or feelings or the uncertainty that had moved through him like weather during the hours he stood there. Aldridge listened without interrupting. When Thomas finished, the commander was quiet for a moment. He looked back at the courtyard. A pigeon landed on the sill outside and then left again. "What you did today will not appear in any record," Aldridge said. "Your post this morning will not be logged in the duty register. The location will not be referenced in any operational document. As far as the institutional record is concerned, Sergeant Harker, you spent this morning on routine patrol in the East Wing." He paused. "But it will not be forgotten." Thomas looked at him. He held the next thing he wanted to say for a moment, measured it, decided it was within his right to ask. "Sir," he said, "what was in that room?" Aldridge turned from the window and looked at him directly. His gray eyes held no cruelty and no warmth. They held only the careful neutrality of a man who had made his decision about this answer long before the question was asked. He said nothing. The silence lasted long enough to be its own answer. Thomas nodded. "I see, sir." "You did your job," Aldridge said. "That is what matters." "Yes, sir." Aldridge moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the handle and looked back at Thomas one final time. "Go home, Sergeant. Rest. You're on morning shift Thursday." He opened the door and left. Thomas stood in the small room alone. The courtyard outside the narrow window was empty now. The pigeon had not come back. Somewhere in the building above him, 4 people who had walked past him in a sub-basement corridor were going about the rest of their day. Meetings, meals, telephone calls, the ordinary rhythm of lives conducted at a level he would never be close to and never fully understand. He thought about the light under the door, the coffee, the sound of papers being moved. He thought about the woman's voice saying, "You have no idea what you are protecting." He thought about Foss saying, "You are making a decision today that you do not have the information to make correctly." They had both been right. He had made a decision without information. He had held a line on behalf of something he could not see, on behalf of people whose names and faces he would never know, in a room that would never be officially acknowledged, in a corridor that appeared on no map. And he would never know if it was the right thing. He put on his jacket. He straightened his collar out of habit. He walked out of the small room and through the familiar corridors of the palace, past the guards he knew and the staff he recognized, and the tourists visible through the tall windows at the ends of the state rooms, small and bright in their colored coats on the gravel below. He signed out at the west gate. Reynolds was still on duty. The older man looked up as Thomas passed his desk, and for a moment their eyes met, and Reynolds gave a very small nod, not the nod of greeting, the nod of acknowledgement. The nod of a man who knew something and was confirming, without words, that he was not going to say it. Thomas nodded back. He walked out into the pale winter afternoon and stood for a moment on the pavement outside the staff entrance. The air was cold and smelled of exhaust and damp stone, and somewhere nearby, bread from a bakery. ordinary smells. The smells of a city going about its business without knowing or caring about the things that happened in its most ancient buildings. He started walking toward the tube. His legs, he realized, ached from the standing. 6 hours and 40-something minutes. He had not noticed it in the corridor. He noticed it now, in the way the body waited for the appropriate moment to report its complaints. His lower back was tight. His left knee, which had given him trouble since a training incident 4 years ago, throbbed with a dull persistence. He walked with it. He was used to walking with things.